Ever wonder how a tiny island, just 90 miles from Florida, can keep rattling American politics for over 60 years? Today, we're diving into the ongoing Cuba-US conflict, what's simmering beneath the headlines, and why it still matters.
You're not kidding, the layers to this story go way beyond cigars and embargoes. I'm excited to break it down with you. I'll handle the quick background, and together we'll dig into what's changed, what's stuck, and what might shift next.
Perfect. Here's our game plan for listeners. First, we'll set the stage with a crash course on how we got here. Then, we'll spotlight recent developments. Next, we'll zoom in on the political and economic pressures on both sides. And finally, we'll map out a few possible futures and wrap up with a pestle analysis to tie it all together.
Let's rewind to the late 1950s. Once Fidel Castro took power in Cuba and the island aligned with the Soviet Union, the U.S. responded with a trade embargo that's still largely in place today.
That decades-long freeze led to some wild moments: the Cuban Missile Crisis, covert ops, and a deep mistrust that shaped both countries' identities. Even after the USSR's collapse, the embargo stuck, partly as leverage and partly to pressure Cuba on human rights.
True, but things did thaw a little under Obama. There were embassies reopened, more travel, and some trade. Then, the Trump administration snapped those ties back into place with new sanctions. Now, Biden's made only small tweaks, mostly around remittances and flights.
The seesawing policy is dizzying, and it keeps Cuban families and businesses caught in the middle. Each administration seems to recalibrate, but the core conflict never really disappears. So, where do things stand right now? The sanctions are biting harder than ever, especially after the pandemic and Cuba's worst economic downturn in decades.
That's had real consequences. Shortages of food, fuel, and medicine have fueled frustration on the island. Last year's protests, the biggest since 1959, showed just how strained things are. And then, you've got the migration spikes, with thousands risking everything to reach the U.S.
It's heartbreaking. And on the U.S. side, the political climate makes any move toward normalization risky. There's pressure from Cuban-American voters, especially in Florida, to keep the hard line.
Absolutely, and every migration wave or protest just sharpens the debate over whether sanctions work or just punish ordinary Cubans. It's a human story and a geopolitical chess match at the same time. The politics are intense, but economics is where things get really tangled. The embargo cuts Cuba off from key markets and investment, but change comes with political costs for U.S. leaders.
And socially, there's a younger generation in Cuba. Many of them grew up after the Cold War, who seem less patient with the status quo. They want more economic opportunity, more freedom, and a real say in their future.
Meanwhile, U.S. policymakers have to weigh diplomatic goals against domestic pressure. It's a classic case of foreign policy colliding with election math, especially in swing states.
And every small shift, an easing of remittances, a crackdown on visas, ripples out to affect families, businesses, and regional stability. It's all tightly interconnected. Given all this, what could actually change in the next few years? I keep hearing that either a sudden breakthrough or a slow grind toward more engagement is possible.
There's always room for surprises. A major humanitarian crisis or leadership transition in Cuba could force talks, even if both sides resist. Or a new wave of protests might put fresh pressure on the Cuban government to reform.
On the U.S. side, a change in administration or Congress could open the door to new negotiations. There's also growing interest in the business community to revisit Cuban markets, which could shift the conversation.
But there's just as much chance of things freezing up. Security concerns, cyber issues, or another diplomatic spat could slam the brakes on any progress. Let's break down the pestle factors shaping this conflict. Politically, both governments face internal pressures: Cuba's from demands for reform, the U.S.'s from electoral politics. Economically, the embargo and Cuba's crisis are central.
Socially, new generations on both sides bring different attitudes. Cuban youth want more agency, while U.S.-born Cuban Americans are sometimes less hardline. Technologically, social media has made protests and information sharing harder to control.
On the environmental front, both countries share hurricane risks and climate concerns that could spark cooperation. Legally, the U.S. embargo is locked in by Congress, making big change tricky without new legislation.
That's a lot of moving parts, each one nudging the relationship in different directions. Sometimes they collide, sometimes they align. So, to wrap up, first, the Cuba-US standoff is shaped by decades of mistrust and shifting policies. Second, economic pain and social change are putting new pressure on both sides. Third, outside factors like migration and global events can tip the scales fast.
If you want to keep up, watch for signals of policy shifts or new unrest in Cuba. Small changes often have big ripple effects. And don't underestimate the power of public opinion on both sides to drive the next chapter.
For listeners who want to dig deeper, I'd say, follow Cuban independent media and U.S. policy updates, and pay attention to local voices affected by these decisions. Understanding the human side makes all the difference.
Thanks for tuning in and thinking critically with us. We'll keep tracking this story until next time. Stay curious and keep asking questions.